Today we're going to be replacing the rear pads, rotors, and seals on a 2013 E350. Your first step is to remove the 10 lug nuts and then remove the rear dolly wheels. And once you have the 10 lug nuts removed, remove the 2 dolly wheels, and your next step is to remove the rear brake caliper off the bracket of the axle. That's going to be a 21 millimeter wrench. These bolts down here are going to be super tight, so it's always a good idea to have a long wrench with you. Leverage is going to be your friend, and sometimes I even use a 4-pound hammer to help break the bolts loose, so that way I can start to do the rest of them by hand. It's always a good idea to use Loctite when reinstalling these bolts so that they don't back themselves out while you're going down the road. I'm going to leave the first one in place, and I'm going to come down and break loose the second one. I'm going to use my hammer right here. Once I have the bottom and the top 21 millimeters out, I then remove the caliper bracket from the rotor, and I like to support these across the top of the leaf spring. Oh, this guy doesn't want to reach for me. So as long as I do not have tension on this hose here, I can lay it up on my jack stand, and I'll grab something to set it on so I'm not hurting it in the future. Set it just like that, and I'll go get a little support for that. So once you have the brake caliper off the brackets of the axle, you can come to the outside of the axle and you have a couple of 14 millimeter bolts that you loosen. It's a very good idea to have a drain pan ready because you will be losing some of your differential fluid when you pull this seal. When I remove bolts like this, sometimes my socket will get stuck on the fastener because of the grease and the grime that builds up in between the crevices, and it makes it super tricky to remove the socket off the bolt. So the reason why I don't pull the bolt all the way is I like to use the tension of the bolt still locked in the axle so that I don't have to fight myself trying to pull the bolt off. Like this. If I pull this out all the way, now it's super tricky for me to pull this apart. If I spread it back in here, I can shake on it, get it out, and then I come back through and take them out. The reason why they get stuck is because I'm using extra tension to break them loose. When they're tight like that, it helps the socket get stuck on the bolt. It's not getting stuck currently because I don't have a lot of tension on it. Once I have those removed, I can pull the axle. There's a little bit of differential fluid that you're going to have leaking out. It's always a good idea to fill that back up at the end. With the axle removed, I can set it behind me in a safe location. Alright, so I want to make a note that there is a special socket used to remove this lock nut. Now, due to some unfortunate circumstances, my socket broke recently and I have not been able to replace it with a new one. So if you found yourself in an unfortunate event such as myself, you can use a little punch or something of the sorts to carefully remove this lock nut. It shouldn't be too tight, but the socket that fits in here fits in these grooves and makes it super easy to remove this with a 1/2-inch ratchet. Like I said, unfortunately, this isn't ideal, but it can work for the situation that we're in. Sometimes if it gets a little bit stuck, I can give it light taps, and when your lock nut is all the way removed, it'll fall right out, and you'll want to be careful because your hub assembly will soon come with it. Once you have the lock nut removed, it's time to remove the hub assembly and the inner bearing. Now, before I do this, I'm going to go ahead and state I have a bunch of Cintas rags on the inside of this rim here, so the oil that's inside the hub assembly is going to drip down onto my Cintas rags and not make a huge mess. Now, you got to be careful with this assembly because a lot of times the rear seal for the hub assembly will catch everything and kind of get it seized up, and it'll pop into your lap and it'll throw this bearing around. So have your hand there ready to catch it and give it a little shake. In a case like this, I'm going to get 2 pick tools and I'm going to remove this seal so I don't damage it, and I'm going to hammer the hub off from the backside. So instead of a pick tool, I opted for some needle nose pliers, and I will carefully grab the inner race and pull it out towards myself. And that is my outer wheel bearing. I'll set that down, and I'll now go get a hammer and hammer this assembly off. So now that I've hammered the hub off of the seal, I can take everything and carefully bring it out. And I'm gonna set my 10 lugs down in the 10 lugs on this rim and let all my oil drain into my rags. This specific setup, I have a little pin that I have to line up between the two lugs. And I'll set that guy down like that. And now I can remove the rotor off the back of the hub. You can clean the old grease off of the spindle, and you can clean with a wire brush and a rag. This is the surface here that the bearing seats on. It's very, very important that you clean that up so that when you reinstall a hub assembly, you don't have any leaks. So once I have the hub assembly removed, I'm going to take an inverted E18 Torx bit and I'm going to remove the inner Torx that hold the rotor to the hub assembly. Once you have those guys removed, the rotor will separate from the hub assembly. From there, we're going to replace the bearing seal and we're going to clean the bearing up. I'll take a long pry bar, position it under the lip of the seal, and I'll smack it with a 5-pound hammer. Let's try the Reaper. It is bad. So after I remove the inner wheel bearing, I'm going to clean our old grease and metal clump up out of this hub. I'm just going to spray it down a little bit and then grab a rag and wipe this area down. Something else that's super beneficial when you're reusing the hub assembly is to remove the orange gasket material from the old bearing seal. You could use a pick tool or a wire brush or anything of the sorts to remove all of this material, because this will create issues when you install the new seal. It won't get a proper seal and you'll have your axle grease leaking onto the backside of your brakes. So instead of going at it with a pick tool and a wire brush, I got a little wire disc on a drill. And what I'm doing is I'm just going around in a circle and I'm removing all of that orange gasket material until I'm back down to bare metal. I had 2 different discs with me. I started with one that was a little bit bigger to get the bulk of it. And now I'm using this little guy to make sure that I get all of that gasket material up and off the metal. Now that I have my bearing cage assembly all cleaned up and I have my hub assembly all cleaned up, I'm going to reinstall the inner bearing. And I'm going to make sure that my seals are the same. I'll set this guy down in here. And I'll take my seal driver. I'll insert that. And then I will carefully install the seal as evenly as possible. I know that the seal is driven all the way down when there is no gap between the end of the seal and the hub assembly. So I'm going to hammer it just a little bit more. Just like that, my gap is closed up all the way. And I'm ready to reinstall the brake rotor on the back of the hub assembly. So after you have your new seal installed and your bearing swapped over, you're going to take all of your inverted T18 bolts, install your Loctite, and I like to hand thread them one by one, and I'm going to torque these down to around 130 foot-pounds. It's very important to use Loctite on these guys because this is what holds the brake rotor to the hub assembly. And it looks like I still have 2 screws in the middle of this wheel, but that's okay. I'll carry on for demonstration. I'll take my E18 socket. I'm going to tighten this down until my wrench clicks over at 130 foot-pounds. All right. Once you got your glove on halfway, take your whole rotor and hub assembly, and you can bring it on back over to the spindle. This is where you want to be careful installing this assembly. You want to make sure that you have grease on the inner seal, because if that inner seal is not greased up, you can tear the seal on the spindle here on the reinstallation. You also want to make sure that you're supporting the hub assembly even and going nice and straight when you're installing on the spindle. I have my outer bearing and my lock nut ready so that the hub assembly doesn't come back off into my lap once I have it installed. So I'm going to lift up. I'm going to come in nice and straight. I'm going to take my outer bearing. I'm going to install that guy. And once I have that started, I can install my lock nut. This is where it's going to get a little tricky because I don't have the proper tool to install this guy. So I'm going to grab my punch and my hammer and carefully rotate that guy clockwise to tighten it up and set the seal. Alrighty, unfortunately I do not have the proper tool with me, so I'm not going to demonstrate what I did on YouTube. The lock nut is fine, don't ask me any questions. The procedure for installing the lock nut goes as follows. You tighten the lock nut down to around 150 foot-pounds, super tight. What you're doing is you're making sure that the seal is fully installed on the back end of this assembly here on the axle. Once that seal is fully installed, you'll notice that the bearings will be kind of tight and it will fight you to rotate. That's when you back the lock nut out until you have a little bit of play in the bearing. You'll feel this whole assembly will go doot, 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 move just a little bit. That's when you tighten this guy back down until you no longer have any play with the hub assembly, and the hub assembly is spinning freely and you don't hear anything grinding up. That's when your lock nut is set in an appropriate position and you can now move forward onto the brake caliper and replacing the pads. After I have my lock nut installed and I have my hub assembly tight and my seals are set, I'm going to take my axle rod and I'm going to reinstall. Got to watch the seal for this axle rod. To line it up, I like to put a couple of the bolts in. You can hold that guy there, and I'll hold it down here as well. That way I'll turn my axle rod, bring it in all the way. These bolts you also want to use Loctite on as well. And these guys will get tightened down to approximately 65 foot-pounds. So I got both wheels up off the ground, so I'm using a pry bar between the lug studs to hold the wheel from moving while I click these guys to 65 foot-pounds. I'm going on this cross pattern here. When I get to 10 lugs, sometimes I lose track of where I need to cross. It's okay. I'm good at crossing 5 lugs. Everybody's good at crossing 4 lugs. If you lose track of your lugs on your cross, just go back in a circle, make sure you've hit all of them. So I have my caliper bracket set up on the wheel here, and the reason why I did that is so that I don't have any tension on my brake line as I'm working on this assembly. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the caliper bracket from the brake caliper with a 10mm 1/2-inch Torx. I'm sorry, this is an Allen, not a Torx. I'm going to come up in here, remove one, and I'm going to come in on the back side, remove the second one. So I readjusted, and I'm coming from the bottom slider pin now, just like that. That's the slider pin. And now that I have the 2 sliders, I can separate the caliper bracket from the caliper. From here, we will decompress these pistons, and we'll clean the bracket and reinstall the new pads. One thing I always like to do when I'm reinstalling new pads and clips on an old caliper bracket is I take a wire brush and I clean all the brake dust and rust corrosion buildup out of the channels for the new clips. So I got my new pads installed and my new clips installed on the caliper bracket, and I cleaned off my brake rotor front and back side with brake cleaner. I'm now going back and reinstalling my 21mm bolts. I have blue Loctite on here. I'm going to bring it in on the back side. Upon installing your new brake pads, you want to add just a little bit of brake grease onto the contact points here. And another good thing to keep note of is that on this job, your pads are labeled outer, and my inner is already installed. Check out the video in the link below for a more in-depth tutorial on how to set up a brake caliper with new brake pads and clips. What I'm doing here is I'm making sure that my grease is on the contact points for the pads. My outer pad is on the outer, and my inner pad is on the inner. Everything's good to go. So now I'm going to work on compressing the pistons on my brake caliper and reinstalling the caliper. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my brake caliper spreader and I'm going to place it between my brake pad and the 2 slider pins, or I'm sorry, the 2 pistons. And I'm using the brake pad here so that I can compress both pistons more evenly. And I spin my T-handle, and as I spin the T-handle, that's going to slowly compress the brake pad and the pistons back into the caliper. The brake pad helps push in on a more even surface, but sometimes you will have to switch from piston to piston as they don't get spread in perfectly even. This one here, I'm going to switch one time just to make sure that the top side is all the way pressed. And once your pistons are compressed all the way back in, you can grease the slider pins and reinstall the brake caliper onto the caliper bracket. So I'm going to make sure that I have my brake pads pressed all the way into the surface of the rotor. And I'm going to take my brake caliper I'm going to bring it over. I'm going to make sure that these rubber boots stay in place and that they don't get pulled out of position as I'm reinstalling. I'm going to drop this guy in. So one thing to make a note of when doing brakes on the 2013 E350 is that you sometimes cannot have access to your slider pins due to the leaf spring when you're installing. So sometimes you have to take your caliper bracket and put it in position on the brake caliper before you install the brake caliper, like so. And now I'm going to install my slider pins, and then I'm going to install the 21s on the brake caliper. Alrighty, it's been about a year for me, so I learned the hard way that you have to set up the caliper bracket on the caliper before you install the caliper onto the axle. And the reason for that is you don't have applicable room to get to the top slider pin for install because of the leaf spring shackle that's in your way. So now that everything's all bolted up proper, I'm going to bring my assembly over and I'm going to slide it on top of the rotor and drop it in like so. I already have Loctite on this 21 millimeter. And with that guy slid in, I'll start it by hand, and then I'll finish it off with my torque wrench. I believe the torque on these 21 millimeters is somewhere around 160 foot-pounds. I got this guy set for around 155, 160 foot-pounds. I'm going to come on in. I'm going to torque her down. The last thing that you want to make sure you get installed on your new caliper is these rubber boots that go over the slider pins. These guys are extremely, extremely important. You want to make sure that they are sealed all the way. If they are not sealed all the way, you're asking for water to get up in your slider pins. When you have water enter your slider pins, that creates corrosion going down the road, and eventually you're going to seize one of those slider pins, and you're going to have uneven brake wear as you're going down the road. That leads to about half of the mileage out of your brake pads that you could really get. So it's really important to make sure that you have these rubber seals set all the way. It's gonna take me a minute to get them set. They're not easy, but I'll show you what they look like when they're set properly.
Yeah, I'm recording.
So when you have your new rubber seal installed, it's gonna look like that. There's a little channel inside of the brake caliper that the rubber seal will sit inside of 360 degrees around. You wanna make sure that it's set in that channel and everything is nice and smooth.